Some other common issues that introduce risk: a lack of a complete and accurate inventory. How many data centers have a really good understanding of the assets they contain? Particularly the IT assets. Tends to be much better on the facilities management side, because we tend to have scheduled maintenance regimes that deal with those facilities assets, the power and the cooling side of things. But on the IT side and the network side, we tend to be pretty poor at keeping records. And of course, if we don't know what's in our data center, it's very, very difficult to actually make sure we're looking after it properly, and that it's being managed correctly. We don't necessarily have good understandings of our capacity requirements. As I said earlier, data centers are built purely to host IT equipment, and yet in some cases we don't plan those deployments. We don't plan the capacity requirements. We also have very misaligned, in some cases, facilities and IT objectives. Again, the objective set are potentially very, very different, and the communication between those disciplines is actually very poor in many cases. We also may find that in some enterprises, particularly, critical resources aren't ring-fenced. So I've seen situations where budgets have been pulled from the critical side of the business into the less critical side of the business, putting the critical side at risk, and the business not understanding that the risk they've actually introduced it by doing that. They've prevented the data center from being maintained, or even life cycle replacements, necessary life cycle replacements being put back beyond what would be considered reasonable, because budgets and resources have been pulled away from those critical areas. And that has, in some really quite evident cases, introduced massive risk and actually failure, genuine failure. The bottom one's an interesting one. One of the reasons that people often don't do things in data centers is they're so afraid of disrupting operations. So they don't do maintenance, they don't test the generators, they don't do all the things that should be done, because they're actually afraid of the potential disruption to service. You can't operate that way. You cannot work on the basis that things are going to go wrong. You have to prevent things from going wrong, and make sure that you are doing the right things by way of maintenance or life cycle replacement, etc. That's a common one, and I think you'll frequently hear stories of people being afraid or not allowed to test the generators because of potential disruption, which is clearly nonsense. If you're not going to test something and you don't believe it's going to work, then how can you possibly rely on it? There are other things that are probably less obvious, and many of those risks really are sort of somewhat hidden. One of the biggest risks I see is just the risk of based on false assumption. People tend to assume things. People might have heard at some point in the dim and distant past that they have a tier 3 data center. They may not know what that means. It may not be something that is really strictly understood, but they've heard it somewhere, they've been told it by people who probably don't really understand it themselves, and on that basis they have made a whole bunch of assumptions, and we'll probably go into some of those assumptions in more detail later. But it is fairly common for people to believe, certainly on the business side of data center operations, and in both enterprises and co-location, that there is more protection available than really exists. And that moves on to the second point: hidden infrastructure risks inherent in the site. That basically is around design. The site has been designed to do a certain job. It may be that there's a flaw in the design, but it may actually be the design is perfectly fit for purpose as intended, but it may not necessarily address the risks that a business now face, because those business criteria and objectives have changed. Again, it's all about poorly informed messages. Then we have the reliance based purely on infrastructure. Will infrastructure get you out of jail? Well, maybe it will do sometimes, but it's far better to have an operational team, an operational understanding that will A, anticipate risks, and B, be able to circumvent anything that does go wrong. I've seen some very, very weak data centers in terms of installed infrastructure that have literally been kept going based on absolute dedication and training and experience of the operational teams. They are, the operational teams can, I think, make up for a great deal of shortfall in the infrastructure, but it doesn't work the other way around. And then I think there's the protection or perceived protection based on contract or SLA. And again, I'm going to go into this in a bit more detail in the rest of the presentation. But I think there's a belief that a contract or SLA will protect you. It won't. It really won't. I mean, if you lose the data center operation, again, there's a risk of the business going down. So no contract or SLA is really going to protect you against that. There are very few contracts or SLAs that protect against consequential loss anyway. There might be penalties associated with contract or SLA, but consequential loss tends not to be included. And that's a pretty big one, actually. I think a lot of people feel that they're protected to a far greater extent by the contract than they really are. And on that point, I'd say that an SLA is pretty pointless if the underlying infrastructure is inadequate. So, if you're signing 100% SLA, it's not going to protect you if the site is not capable of supporting 100% availability. It's a kind of a meaningless SLA. Yes, there might be some penalty involved in that, but again, the penalty is not really ever going to cover the real problems, the real losses, the real negative PR and the negative customer responses to a long-term failure, for instance. And I think when we come to data centers, particularly if we consider data centers as being the building rather than the IT infrastructure, it's fairly common, I think, not to take into account the IT infrastructure and the capabilities of that infrastructure, which I think should be factored in when you're thinking about what is appropriate from a building perspective.